The world celebrates growth, more employees, more offices, more investors, more headlines about success, because from the outside, a growing company looks powerful. But what most people never see is how some companies quietly begin collapsing under their own weight, not because they are failing, because they are growing too fast to control themselves. That's exactly what happened to Daniel Mercer. In 2021, Daniel was one of the most respected CEOs in the tech world. At only 41 years old, he had transformed Nexora into one of the fastest-growing software companies in America. The timing couldn't have been better. The remote work boom changed everything. Suddenly, companies all over the world desperately needed digital tools, cloud systems, virtual collaboration platforms, and automation software. And Nexora happened to provide exactly that. Demand exploded almost overnight. New customers arrived faster than the company could process. Revenue charts climbed aggressively every quarter. Investors poured billions into the business. Business magazines called Daniel the future of modern leadership. Podcasts invited him constantly. Young entrepreneurs studied his interviews obsessively. To many people, Daniel Mercer looked like the perfect modern CEO, calm, visionary, disciplined. But the thing investors loved most about him was speed. Daniel moved fast, very fast. While competitors hesitated, Nexora expanded aggressively. New offices opened in San Francisco, Austin, Toronto, London, and Singapore. Entire floors of luxury office buildings were filled in months. The company hired thousands of employees in record time. Recruiters worked almost non-stop. Every week, hundreds of new workers joined the company. At one point, Nexora became so large so quickly that employees joked nobody could recognize half the people inside the headquarters anymore, but nobody cared, because growth hides problems, and Nexora was growing faster than almost anyone in the industry. Inside the offices, the atmosphere felt electric. Massive digital screens displayed live company metrics. Employees celebrated every new funding round like a victory parade. Managers constantly repeated the same phrase, "We're building the future." And for a while, it actually felt true. Daniel walked confidently through crowded office floors, while employees admired him from a distance. To many workers, he represented ambition itself. The company offered incredible salaries, luxury offices, unlimited perks, free food, private wellness spaces, massive signing bonuses. People dreamed about working there. And from the outside, Nexora looked unstoppable, like the kind of company that would dominate the tech industry for decades. But behind the scenes, something dangerous had already started happening. At first, the signs were almost invisible. Small delays in product, launches. Meetings becoming longer, simple decisions suddenly requiring approval from multiple departments. Projects slowing down for reasons nobody could clearly explain. Then communication problems started appearing everywhere. Teams stopped understanding what other teams were doing. Managers created new meetings to solve problems caused by previous meetings. Entire departments became trapped in endless internal processes, and strangely, despite having more employees than ever before, the company started feeling less productive. Daniel noticed it slowly. A project that once took 2 weeks now took 2 months. Software updates became delayed, internal systems became chaotic, and every attempt to fix the confusion seemed to create even more complexity. But the most terrifying part? Almost nobody inside the company wanted to admit there was a problem, because Nexora still looked successful from the outside. Revenue was still growing. The media still praised the company. Investors still celebrated expansion. So whenever someone raised concerns internally, the answer was always the same. We're growing. As if growth itself automatically meant health. But Daniel started feeling something he could not ignore. The company was becoming heavier, slower, more fragile, and deep down, he feared Nexora was slowly losing control of itself. At first, everything still looked normal. That was the dangerous part. From the outside, Nexora continued growing aggressively. Revenue charts still climbed every quarter. Investors still celebrated earnings calls. Business magazines still praised Daniel Mercer as one of the smartest CEOs in tech. New offices kept opening around the world. Entire buildings were redesigned with futuristic architecture. Luxury workspaces, meditation rooms, rooftop lounges, and massive collaborative environments. On social media, employees posted glamorous videos of life inside Nexora. It looked like the perfect modern company, and internally, that illusion protected the real problem. Because while the company looked successful from the outside, inside the system, things were quietly slowing down. At first, the delays seemed small, a product update arriving 1 week late, a software rollout postponed temporarily, marketing campaign requiring extra approvals. Nobody panicked. Large companies naturally become more complex over time. That was normal, or at least that's what everyone kept telling themselves. But then the delays became impossible to ignore. Projects that once moved quickly suddenly became trapped inside endless approval chains. A simple design change now required meetings with multiple departments. Managers scheduled meetings to prepare for other meetings. Entire days disappeared without real progress happening. Employees started joking internally that the company had become a calendar organization. At first, Daniel laughed at those comments. Then he realized they weren't jokes anymore. One afternoon, he attended a product strategy meeting, scheduled for 30 minutes. It lasted almost 4 hours. Dozens of employees debated minor decisions endlessly. Nobody wanted responsibility. Nobody wanted risk, and by the end of the meeting, almost nothing had actually been decided. That moment stayed in Daniel's mind because years earlier, Nexora operated completely differently. Small teams moved fast. People built things quickly. Ideas became products almost immediately. Now, everything felt heavy, slow, complicated. And the strangest part was this: the company had more talent than ever before, more engineers, more managers, more specialists, more executives, yet somehow output kept decreasing. Daniel started reviewing internal productivity reports personally, and what he found terrified him that entire departments were producing almost no meaningful results. Some teams spent months preparing presentations instead of building products, and other departments duplicated work because communication between teams had collapsed. Managers hired more employees to solve inefficiency, which only created even more inefficiency. The company had entered a dangerous cycle. Growth created complexity. Complexity slowed execution. Slow execution created more management layers, and those layers created even more complexity. But because revenue was still increasing, most executives ignored the warning signs. Investors still saw growth. The media still celebrated expansion. So internally, almost nobody wanted to question the system, because questioning the system sounded negative. And during periods of growth, companies often become addicted to optimism. Daniel started noticing the cultural shift. Everywhere, employees became afraid to make decisions without approval. Teams focused more on avoiding mistakes than creating innovation. People protected processes instead of solving problems. The company was no longer operating like a startup. It was starting to behave like a bureaucracy, and bureaucracy kills speed. One night, long after most employees had left the headquarters, Daniel walked alone through several office floors. Thousands of desks, hundreds of glowing computer screens left on overnight, entire departments filled with people during the day. And suddenly, he had a terrifying thought. What if all this growth was making the company weaker instead of stronger? Because in business, size and strength are not always the same thing. A massive company can still become fragile internally, and Daniel slowly realized something most CEOs never want to admit. Nexora wasn't becoming more powerful. It was becoming heavier. And heavy companies struggle to move when the world changes fast. That realization scared him more than falling revenue ever could, because falling revenue can sometimes be fixed. But a company, trapped under its own complexity, can slowly suffocate without even realizing it. Late at night, long after most employees had gone home, Daniel Mercer stopped trusting summaries because summaries hide problems. Executives filtered information. Managers softened bad news. Departments protected themselves politically. And the larger Nexora became the harder it became to see what was actually happening inside the company. So Daniel started reviewing internal reports personally, alone, usually after midnight. Inside his office, the headquarters looked completely different at night. The energy disappeared, the excitement faded. Without the noise of thousands of employees, the building felt strangely cold, silent. And under that silence, Daniel began uncovering things that deeply disturbed him. Communication. Delays everywhere, teams waiting weeks for approvals. Departments unable to coordinate simple projects. Engineers complaining they spent more time updating management systems than building actual software. Then came the duplicated roles. Entire groups doing nearly identical work without realizing it. Different departments, creating competing versions of the same internal tools. Managers hiring new employees to solve problems created by other unnecessary hires. The structure had become so large that parts of the company stopped understanding each other completely, and the deeper Daniel looked, the worse it became. At one point, he discovered a department where multiple managers spent most of their time supervising meetings between other managers. Not products, not innovation. Meetings. The company was slowly becoming administrative instead of creative. That terrified him, because Nexora was originally built around speed, fast decisions, fast execution, fast innovation. Now, even small ideas became trapped inside endless layers of bureaucracy. One internal report hit Daniel particularly hard. It showed that some teams had dozens of employees without clearly defined responsibilities. People attended meetings daily without fully understanding what they were actually accountable for. And over time, that confusion destroyed urgency. Employees stopped acting like builders. They started acting like corporate survivors, protecting positions, avoiding risks, delaying responsibility. The culture was changing, and not in a good way. Despite having more workers than ever before, innovation inside the company was dying. That was the most dangerous realization of all, because technology companies survive through innovation. Without it, growth eventually becomes an illusion. Daniel noticed it everywhere. Smaller competitors started releasing products faster. Startups moved quicker than Nexora's massive teams. Features that once took weeks to build now took months. And internally, people had started accepting slowness as normal. That frightened Daniel more than any financial report, because once a company emotionally accepts inefficiency, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse. Then the investors started asking difficult questions. At first, the conversations were polite. We're noticing execution delays. Margins are shrinking. Why are operational costs rising so aggressively? Daniel answered confidently at first. Growth pains, scaling challenges, temporary inefficiencies. But privately, he was becoming less certain every week. Then came the meeting that changed everything. One major investor displayed internal performance data during a board review and asked a simple question. Why does Nexora employ nearly twice as many people as its competitors while releasing products slower? The room became silent. Daniel tried explaining the complexity of scaling global operations, the need for infrastructure, long-term positioning. But while he spoke, he realized something terrifying. Even he no longer fully believed the explanations, because deep down he knew the investor was right. The company had become bloated, and for the first time since building Nexora, Daniel Mercer realized he no longer had good answers. That moment stayed in his mind for weeks, because CEOs are expected to project certainty, confidence, control. But, alone at night, reviewing endless reports under the glow of computer screens, Daniel started confronting a possibility he never imagined before. Maybe Nexora's biggest threat wasn't competition. Maybe the company itself had become the problem. Then, the economy changed, and suddenly, all the problems Daniel Mercer had been quietly observing inside Nexora became impossible to hide anymore. For years, the tech industry had operated in an atmosphere of unlimited optimism. Investors poured money into growth, companies hired aggressively, executives expanded as fast as possible, As long as revenue kept increasing, almost nobody cared about efficiency. But in late 2021, that environment started collapsing. Tech stocks began falling across the market. Interest rates increased. Investors became nervous. And for the first time in years, companies were no longer being judged only by growth. Now they were being judged by sustainability. Profitability, efficiency, and Nexora suddenly looked dangerously exposed. Inside board meetings, the tone changed completely. Conversations that once focused on expansion now focused on costs, operational costs, payroll costs, infrastructure costs. The company had become enormous, and maintaining that size required terrifying amounts of money every month. Daniel started receiving private calls from investors almost daily. Some conversations sounded calm, others sounded desperate. One investor warned him directly, "If the market keeps getting worse, companies like Nexora will be punished first." Another told him, "You built an incredible company, but it's becoming financially dangerous." That sentence stayed in Daniel's mind, financially dangerous, because deep down, he knew they were right. Nexora's structure was becoming unsustainable. The company employed thousands of people across multiple countries. Entire departments operated with unclear objectives. Management layers multiplied constantly, and as revenue growth slowed, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Then came the financial projections. And they terrified him. If market conditions worsened further, Nexora could enter a dangerous cycle. Shrinking growth, rising operational costs, falling investor confidence, and once confidence disappears in the tech industry, collapse can happen very fast. For several nights, Daniel barely slept. He walked alone through the empty headquarters after midnight, staring at floors filled with expensive offices and endless rows of desks. Years earlier, all this growth felt exciting. Now it felt heavy, like a machine becoming too large to control. That was when Daniel made the decision that would change everything. Not gradually, not carefully, completely. Over one weekend, a small internal executive group prepared what would become the most controversial moment in Nexora's history. Confidential meetings, emergency financial modeling, massive restructuring plans. Only a handful of people inside the company knew what was coming, and even many of them struggled to believe it. Then Monday arrived. Early that morning, thousands of Nexora employees around the world received the same calendar notification simultaneously. Global operational restructuring. No explanation, no details, just the title. Inside offices, confusion spread instantly. Employees messaged each other nervously. Managers pretended to stay calm while secretly panicking themselves. People refreshed, internal. Communication channels obsessively searching for answers. Within minutes, rumors exploded everywhere. Then, a few hours later, Daniel Mercer appeared on screen during a global livestream broadcast to the entire company. Thousands of employees watched from offices, apartments, meeting rooms, cafeterias, and laptops around the world. Daniel looked exhausted, calmer than expected, but exhausted for a few seconds. He simply stared at the camera in silence, and somehow, that silence felt terrifying. Then he finally spoke. "The company we built is no longer operating the way it needs to." The room inside the headquarters became completely still. Employees barely moved. Daniel explained that Nexora had become too complex, too slow, too inefficient. And then he said the words nobody expected to hear. Nexora would eliminate nearly half the company. Immediately. The silence afterward was devastating. Some employees froze completely. Others started crying before the live stream even ended. Managers looked physically sick. Entire teams stared at each other in disbelief, because in a single sentence, everything changed. People who spent years building their careers at Nexora suddenly realized they might lose everything within hours. Inside the offices, the emotional atmosphere became surreal. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew who would stay or who would disappear. And somewhere behind the camera, Daniel Mercer understood that from that moment forward, the world would never see him the same way again. The backlash exploded instantly. Before the live stream had even finished, social media was already on fire. Clips of Daniel Mercer announcing the layoffs spread across every platform within minutes. People reposted the video with captions like, "The coldest CEO in tech. Another billionaire sacrificing workers to save profits. This is what corporate greed looks like." The internet turned against him almost overnight. On Twitter, hashtags calling for boycotts started trending. TikTok creators reacted emotionally to the layoffs. LinkedIn filled with angry posts from former employees describing the company as fake and soulless. Daniel's face became the symbol of corporate betrayal. News channels amplified everything. Financial media dissected the decision non-stop. Some analysts defended the restructuring as necessary, but most focused on the emotional impact. One major news anchor described the layoffs as a brutal reminder that loyalty inside corporations is often an illusion. That sentence spread everywhere online, and for thousands of former employees it felt true. People who had spent years helping build Nexora suddenly lost access to their accounts, offices, and careers within hours. Some employees recorded emotional goodbye videos from parking lots after leaving headquarters, carrying boxes of personal belongings. Others posted messages thanking co-workers they might never see again. One engineer wrote, "I gave this company 4 years of my life. Today, I found out through a calendar notification that I no longer belong here." That post alone received millions of views. And emotionally, the damage inside Nexora became catastrophic. Fear spread everywhere. Employees who survived the layoffs stopped feeling secure, because if half the company could disappear overnight, what guaranteed the rest would stay? Trust in leadership collapsed. Hallways that once felt energetic now felt tense and silent. Conversations stopped when managers entered rooms. Employees began avoiding long-term planning because nobody believed stability existed anymore, and the psychological atmosphere became even worse because of uncertainty. Nobody fully understood why certain people stayed while others disappeared. Some highly talented employees were laid off. Some average performers remained. That randomness created paranoia inside the company. Managers secretly updated resumes late at night. Recruiters from competing companies aggressively targeted remaining Nexora employees. Several important executives quietly left within weeks. Even people who defended Daniel publicly started doubting him privately because the layoffs felt too massive, too sudden, too brutal. And financially, things became even worse. Much worse. The company spent hundreds of millions of dollars on severance packages, legal restructuring, benefits and operational transitions. Stock prices dropped again after the announcement. Investors worried about reputational damage. Some clients even questioned whether Nexora was stable enough to continue long-term partnerships. For a brief period, it genuinely looked like the company might collapse under the pressure, and Daniel felt all of it personally. For weeks, cameras followed him everywhere. Photographers waited outside headquarters daily. Commentators analyzed his facial expressions during interviews. Like he was a politician during a scandal, some people openly called him evil. Others called him a coward hiding behind financial language to justify destroying lives. Daniel stopped reading social media completely, but even without reading it, he could feel the hatred everywhere. Late at night, alone inside his office, he sometimes replayed the live stream announcement in his mind repeatedly. The silence, the faces, the shock, and for the first time since building Nexora, he questioned whether he had gone too far. Because from the outside, it truly looked like Daniel Mercer had destroyed his own company. A CEO who built one of the fastest-growing tech businesses in the world, only to become the man who tore it apart himself. A few months later, something strange started happening inside Nexora. At first, almost nobody noticed it. The media was still focused on the layoffs. Social media still treated Daniel Mercer like a villain. Former employees continued posting emotional stories online. From the outside, the company still looked damaged, but internally, the entire system was beginning to change, and the changes were impossible to ignore. Projects that once took 6 months suddenly started moving in weeks. At first, managers assumed it was temporary. Maybe the remaining employees were simply working harder out of fear. But then the pattern continued. Small teams started delivering faster than entire departments had. Before, software updates moved quicker. Internal approvals became dramatically simpler, and for the first time in years, people inside Nexora felt momentum again. One engineer described it perfectly during an internal meeting. "It finally feels like we can breathe." That sentence spread quietly across the company because many employees secretly felt the same way. Before the restructuring, almost everything inside Nexora had become slow and exhausting. Simple ideas required endless approvals. Meetings consumed entire days. Employees constantly waited for responses from other departments. Now, most of those layers were gone, and suddenly, things started moving. Meetings disappeared almost overnight. Not completely, but dramatically. Entire calendars that once looked impossible to manage suddenly became almost empty. Managers realized many meetings had existed only because the company had become too complicated to communicate efficiently. People had spent years talking about work instead of actually doing work. Now smaller teams operated with direct communication. No endless chains of approvals. No 6-person decision committees. No weeks waiting for executive reviews. Employees simply solved problems faster. And surprisingly, the quality of execution improved too, because smaller teams carried clearer responsibility. People understood exactly what they owned, exactly what they were accountable for. That clarity changed behavior completely. Before, employees often hid inside massive departments where responsibility became invisible. Now, every contribution mattered, and that created urgency. Again, Daniel noticed the shift immediately. One afternoon, he reviewed a product timeline comparison from before and after the restructuring. The difference shocked him. A feature that previously required dozens of employees and months of coordination had just been completed by a smaller team in less than 3 weeks. Not because people suddenly became smarter, because complexity had been removed. That realization became one of the most important moments in Daniel's life. For years, Nexora believed more people automatically meant more progress, but internally, too many layers had created friction everywhere, and friction destroys speed. The cultural atmosphere inside the company also began changing in unexpected ways. Surprisingly, employee satisfaction among the remaining workforce started increasing. At first, Daniel didn't believe the reports. How could morale improve after such devastating layoffs? But when leadership investigated further, the answer became clear. Employees finally felt connected to their work again. Teams became smaller, communication became direct. Talented workers gained more autonomy. People stopped feeling trapped inside giant bureaucratic systems. One product designer explained it during an anonymous internal survey. "For the first time in years, I actually feel like my work matters." That sentence deeply affected Daniel, because years earlier, that feeling was exactly what made Nexora special, and somewhere along the way, the company had lost it. Now it was slowly returning. The atmosphere inside headquarters became different, lighter, sharper, focused. Again, the fear from the layoff still existed. Of course it did. But underneath that fear, something else was growing. Momentum. The company no longer felt bloated and confused. It felt dangerous again. Fast, aggressive, alive, and financially. The numbers started changing too. Operational costs dropped dramatically. Execution speed increased. Product launches accelerated. Within months, investors who once panicked began quietly changing their tone. Some even admitted privately that the restructuring was working far better than expected. But the most fascinating part, Nexora had become stronger after becoming smaller, and that completely changed the way Daniel Mercer understood business forever. Years later, after Nexora had already recovered financially, Daniel Mercer finally explained what really happened inside the company. The interview took place at a business leadership conference in Chicago. By then, the public perception around him had changed, not completely. Some people still hated him for the layoffs, but others started viewing him differently, as the CEO who made one of the most controversial decisions in modern tech, and somehow survived it. During the interview, the host asked the question everyone wanted answered: what exactly went wrong inside Nexora? Daniel stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then he gave an answer that surprised the entire audience. We confused growth with effectiveness. That sentence instantly changed the atmosphere in the room, because deep down, almost every executive there understood exactly what he meant. Daniel explained that during Nexora's explosive rise, hiring became addictive. Every quarter, the company celebrated expansion. More engineers, more managers, more offices, more departments, and externally, it looked impressive. Investors loved large numbers. The media associated rapid hiring with strength. Employees interpreted expansion as stability. So, over time, the company developed a dangerous psychological belief. If growth feels good, more growth must always be better. But internally, something very different was happening. The structure became heavier every year. New management layers appeared constantly. Then more layers were added to manage the previous layers. Simple decisions that once took minutes started taking weeks, not because employees became less intelligent, because the system itself became slower. Daniel described it perfectly during the interview. At some point, we stopped building products and started managing complexity. That line spread everywhere online afterward, because it perfectly described what happens to many fast-growing companies. The audience listened silently, while Daniel explained how innovation slowly began suffocating inside. Nexora, every new department created additional communication friction. Every additional approval chain slowed execution. Every extra manager added another layer between ideas and action. And over time, employees became psychologically trapped inside process. People focused more on navigating the organization than creating meaningful work. The company still looked successful externally, but internally, energy was disappearing. Daniel admitted something particularly uncomfortable during the interview. Many leaders inside Nexora secretly believed hiring people solved problems automatically, falling behind on a project. Hire more people, communication issues, create another management role, execution delays, add more oversight. But those solutions often created even more complexity, and complexity compounds over time, slowly, quietly, dangerously. Daniel compared the company to a giant machine carrying too much weight. At first, you don't notice it, he explained. The machine still moves, but every layer adds resistance, and eventually, the system spends more energy carrying itself than moving forward. The room became completely silent, because many executives watching realized they were experiencing the exact same problem inside their own companies. Daniel then revealed the most painful realization of all. Nexora wasn't becoming faster as it grew, it was becoming slower, not more innovative, more bureaucratic, not more agile, more fragile. And the terrifying part was that almost nobody noticed it, while the company was still making money, because revenue can hide dysfunction for a very long time, especially during economic booms. But eventually, reality catches up, and when the economy weakened, Nexora's internal inefficiencies suddenly became impossible to ignore. Daniel admitted that by the time he recognized the scale of the problem, the company was already dangerously close to losing control of itself. The layoffs were not just about saving money, they were about removing weight, complexity, friction. Because the company wasn't collapsing from lack of talent, it was slowly collapsing under its own structure. And according to Daniel, that is one of the most dangerous things that can happen to any successful business. Not sudden failure, but gradual paralysis disguised as growth. The restructuring forced Nexora to rebuild itself from the ground up. Not around appearance, around efficiency. That change transformed everything. Before the layoffs, the company had become obsessed with looking powerful, massive departments, huge office expansions, complicated organizational charts. Externally, it created the image of a dominant tech empire. But internally, that image came at a massive cost. After the restructuring, Daniel Mercer made a decision that completely changed the company's philosophy. No more unnecessary layers, no more endless management chains, no more building teams simply to make the company appear larger. From that moment forward, every part of Nexora would be designed around speed and execution. smaller teams gained dramatically more autonomy, and that autonomy changed employee behavior almost immediately. Before, workers spent huge amounts of time asking for permission. Approval from managers, approval from directors, approval from other departments. Ideas moved slowly because responsibility was spread across too many people. Now, small teams owned projects directly. If something needed to be built, they built it. If something needed to change, they changed it, without endless bureaucracy suffocating every decision. For many talented employees, the transformation felt almost shocking. People who once felt trapped inside giant corporate systems suddenly had room to execute ideas again. One senior engineer later described the experience like this. It felt like the company finally removed the brakes. That was exactly what Daniel wanted, because during Nexora's rapid growth phase, the company slowly lost its startup mentality. Employees became cautious, political, process-oriented. Now the culture started changing completely. The people who remained inside the company became more focused, not because they were forced to work harder, because clarity returned. Employees finally understood priorities again. Communication became simpler, faster, direct. Before the restructuring, projects often required coordination across multiple departments that barely understood each other. Now, smaller groups communicated naturally. Problems got solved in hours instead of weeks. Meetings became shorter, sometimes unnecessary entirely, and as the complexity disappeared, something incredibly important returned to the company. Innovation. For years, Nexora had become reactive, slow, predictable. Now the energy inside the company started feeling aggressive again. Creative teams experimented faster, product launches accelerated, engineers regained excitement, and internally people began noticing something strange. The company no longer felt corporate. It felt alive again. Daniel noticed it too. Walking through the headquarters felt completely different now. The atmosphere had changed. Before, the building felt crowded but strangely disconnected. Now smaller groups worked intensely with clear direction. There was less noise, less confusion, but far more momentum, and the results became impossible to ignore. Within months, execution speed improved dramatically. Operational costs dropped. Profit margins increased. Investors who once feared collapse suddenly became optimistic again. Then came the moment that shocked the entire industry. Within 2 years, Nexora became more profitable than ever before. Not slightly more profitable, massively more profitable. And the most uncomfortable part for many people was this. The company achieved those results with far fewer employees. That forced executives across the tech world to confront a terrifying question. How many large companies were carrying enormous amounts of unnecessary complexity without realizing it? Suddenly, CEOs everywhere started talking about efficiency, agility, lean structures, focus. And behind closed doors, many companies quietly began copying parts of Nexora's restructuring strategy, because Daniel Mercer had proven something most corporations never want to admit. Bigger is not always better. Sometimes, smaller teams move faster, think clearer, and create far more value, especially when talented people are finally allowed to execute instead of constantly asking for permission. For Daniel, the lesson became painfully clear. Nexora didn't become stronger because it grew endlessly. It became stronger when it finally stopped carrying weight it no longer needed. The corporate world became obsessed with Daniel Mercer's decision. At first, most executives publicly criticized him. The layoffs were too controversial, too aggressive, too emotionally damaging. No major CEO wanted to openly defend what Nexora had done, especially while social media still treated Daniel like a villain. But privately, the conversation looked completely different, because behind closed doors, CEOs everywhere started studying the numbers. And the numbers were impossible to ignore. Nexora had become faster, more efficient, more profitable, and somehow the company achieved all of it after cutting nearly half its workforce. That result sent shockwaves through the business world. Business. Schools quickly turned the restructuring into a case study. Professors analyzed the timeline step by step. the explosive growth, the internal complexity, the layoffs, the recovery. Students debated whether Daniel Mercer was brilliant or ruthless. Some argued he saved the company, others believed he sacrificed people to protect profitability. And honestly, both sides had valid arguments. That tension made the story fascinating, because Daniel's decision forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality about modern corporations. Sometimes companies grow so large, they stop functioning efficiently. But admitting that publicly is dangerous, especially for executives, because large organizations often equate size with strength. More employees create the appearance of power, more departments create the illusion of sophistication. But internally, those same layers can slowly suffocate a company. And deep down, many CEOs recognize the exact same symptoms inside their own businesses. Too many approval chains, too many meetings, too many managers managing other managers, too many departments protecting territory instead of solving problems. Too much complexity, too much weight. The more executives studied Nexora's story, the more uncomfortable they became, because many realized their own companies were drifting in the same direction. Revenue still looked healthy, growth still looked impressive. But internally, execution kept slowing down, innovation kept becoming harder, decision-making kept becoming heavier. Daniel Mercer had simply reached the breaking point before everyone else. And once people understood that, the perception around him slowly started changing. Some executives began privately calling him visionary. Others called him dangerous, because if Daniel was right, then many modern corporations were far more fragile than they appeared. Within a few years, subtle changes started spreading across the tech industry. Companies stopped bragging only about headcount growth. Executives began talking obsessively about lean structures and operational efficiency. Smaller autonomous teams became fashionable again. Large organizations quietly reduced management layers. Some companies even hired consulting firms specifically to identify organizational friction. But publicly, almost nobody admitted where the inspiration came from, because Nexora's restructuring remained controversial. People still remembered the emotional fallout, the layoffs, the fear, the public outrage. And Daniel himself understood that his legacy would probably always remain divided. Some people would forever see him as ruthless. Others would see him as one of the few CEOs willing to confront reality before it destroyed the company completely. Years later, during another interview, Daniel was asked whether he regretted the decision. He paused for several seconds before answering. Then he said something that perfectly summarized the entire story. Most companies don't collapse because they stop growing. They collapse because they become too heavy to adapt. That sentence spread across the business world almost instantly, because for many executives, it felt less like a quote and more like a warning. Today, many people still criticize Daniel Mercer. Even years after Nexora recovered, the debate never truly disappeared. Some people call him cold, a ruthless executive who sacrificed thousands of employees to protect a company. Others call him visionary, one of the few CEOs willing to make impossible decisions before the situation became irreversible. And honestly, that division will probably follow him forever, because stories like this are uncomfortable. There are no perfect heroes, no perfect outcomes, no decisions without consequences. Thousands of people lost jobs, families were affected, careers changed overnight. That part of the story is real, and Daniel himself never tried to deny it. But his story also revealed something deeply uncomfortable about modern companies, something most executives privately understand, but rarely say out loud. Sometimes businesses do not fail because they are too small. Sometimes they fail because they become too bloated to move. Too many layers, too many meetings, too many systems protecting themselves instead of creating value. And the terrifying part is that this kind of collapse often happens slowly, quietly. A company can still look successful externally while internally becoming weaker every year. Revenue can hide dysfunction, growth can hide inefficiency, expansion can hide paralysis, until one day the company becomes so heavy that it can no longer adapt fast enough to survive. That's what Daniel Mercer recognized before most people. did Nexora wasn't dying because it lacked talent. It was dying because complexity was suffocating execution, and once he understood that, he faced the hardest reality any leader can face. Fixing the company would require pain, massive pain, the kind of decision almost everyone would hate him for. And that's exactly why the story became so controversial, because most people admire difficult decisions only after they work, not while they are happening. During the layoffs, Daniel looked cruel, dangerous, heartless. But years later, many of the same executives who criticized him publicly quietly copied his philosophy. Lean teams, faster execution, less bureaucracy, more autonomy. Because deep down, they understood he had identified a real problem inside modern corporations, one that continues growing silently inside companies all over the world. And maybe that's the most important lesson in this entire story. In business, growth alone is not strength. A company is only strong if it can still move quickly when the world changes, if it can still innovate, still adapt, still make decisions without drowning in its own structure. Because once complexity becomes heavier than execution, even successful companies begin collapsing from the inside. Daniel Mercer learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. And in the end, he discovered something most leaders spend their entire careers trying to avoid. Sometimes, the decisions that save a company are the exact same decisions that make the world hate you first. And maybe that's why the hardest decisions in business are often the ones that look cruel before they look brilliant. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Profit and Peril, because here we explore the most risky, controversial, and unexpected decisions in the business world, and the stories behind companies that almost collapsed, but found a way to come back stronger than ever. Stories about profit, power, ambition, failure, and the decisions that changed everything. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and get ready for the next story, because sometimes a single decision can destroy an empire or transform it into something even greater.